On June 22, 1940, France surrendered to Germany. Britain stood alone against the Third Reich. To most Germans, victory seemed inevitable. Their armies had crushed Poland in weeks, overrun Denmark and Norway, smashed through Belgium and the Netherlands, and forced the mighty French to capitulate. The Wehrmacht appeared unstoppable. Yet across the English Channel, Prime Minister Winston Churchill vowed that Britain would fight on. What followed was not the swift conquest Germans expected, but a prolonged air campaign that would test Germany's confidence and expose deep contradictions in how the Reich's citizens understood the war. This is the story of how ordinary Germans experienced the Battle of Britain, how propaganda shaped their perceptions, and how doubt gradually crept into the promise of inevitable triumph. Before we go deeper into how this aerial confrontation challenged Germany's sense of invincibility, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. After France's defeat, Adolf Hitler believed Britain would see reason and accept peace terms. On July 19, 1940, Hitler addressed the Reichstag in Berlin with what he called his final appeal to Britain. The speech lasted nearly 3 hours. Hitler praised Germany's victories, promoted military officers, and toward the end extended what he described as an offer of peace to avoid the destruction of the British Empire. To German ears, this sounded magnanimous. Hitler appeared as a statesman offering mercy to a defeated enemy. The German press portrayed Britain's rejection of the peace offer as evidence of British warmongerness and unreasonable stubbornness. One German soldier wrote to his wife that the war could now only be decided with brutal force, adding that the English wanted it that way. He saw no reason to feel sorry for them, noting that Hitler had offered them the hand of peace often enough. This sentiment reflected a broader German belief that their nation sought peace, while Britain insisted on continuing a war it had already lost. The propaganda machine cultivated this narrative carefully. When British bombers struck targets in northern Germany during June and July 1940, German authorities claimed these attacks revealed Britain's true aggressive nature. The bombing of the German city of Freiburg on May 10, 1940, was attributed to the Royal Air Force in German newspapers, though in reality, German aircraft had accidentally bombed their own city during confused operations. This incident was used to portray Britain as targeting civilians deliberately. German propaganda contrasted this with Germany's treatment of Paris, which had been declared an open city and spared destruction. The narrative insisted that Germany conducted military operations with precision and honor, while Britain bombed indiscriminately. This carefully constructed story found receptive audiences among Germans who had experienced British naval blockades during the First World War and remembered the hardships those blockades inflicted. On August 1, 1940, Hitler issued Directive No. 17, ordering the Luftwaffe to overcome the Royal Air Force with all means at its disposal. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most powerful deputies, exuded confidence. Göring had famously declared that if enemy bombers ever reached the Ruhr industrial region, Germans could call him by the Jewish name Meyer, a boast that expressed his absolute certainty in the Luftwaffe's defensive capabilities. Now he promised that his Air Force would sweep the RAF from British skies within weeks, paving the way for Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious invasion of Britain. Eagle Day, Adlertag, was scheduled for mid-August after delays caused by poor weather. The assault began on August 13, 1940, with waves of bombers and fighters attacking Royal Air Force airfields across southern England. German pilots flew sortie after sortie, engaging RAF fighters in dogfights over Kent, Sussex, and Essex. The Luftwaffe reported substantial victories. By August 19th, German records claimed 624 British aircraft destroyed against 174 German losses. These numbers circulated through German military channels and filtered into public consciousness. Victory appeared imminent. The German public followed the campaign with intense interest. Newspapers published maps of England marked with bombing targets. Cinemas showed newsreel footage of Luftwaffe formations flying toward Britain, of bombs falling, of pilots returning to French airfields and describing their missions. The press could hardly satisfy the public's hunger for information about the air war. Germans had become accustomed to swift, decisive campaigns. Poland fell in 5 weeks. Denmark capitulated in hours. Norway resisted for 2 months, but ultimately succumbed. France, the great adversary of the First World War, surrendered in 6 weeks. Britain's continued resistance seemed like temporary defiance that would soon crumble under sustained bombing. The propaganda machine framed the battle as a war of numbers and attrition. Each day brought reports of RAF airfields destroyed, aircraft shot down, industrial targets hit. The impression was one of methodical dismantling of British air power. Germans believed they were witnessing the final chapter of the campaign in the West. Then, on the night of August 25, 1940, Royal Air Force bombers reached Berlin. The raid caused minimal damage. A few buildings were hit. Casualties were light, but the psychological impact was profound. Hermann Göring had promised that enemy bombers would never reach the German capital. Berliners had believed him. The sound of air raid sirens, the distant rumble of explosions, the sight of searchlights sweeping the night sky shattered that certainty. People who had felt secure now understood they were not beyond the reach of British retaliation. The bombers returned on subsequent nights. Damage remained limited, but the violation of German airspace over the capital city humiliated the Luftwaffe command and exposed Göring's boast as hollow. Germans began calling him Meyer, using the very name he had invoked to express his confidence. The ridicule was widespread enough to reach the ears of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi security service, which monitored public morale and opinion. Hitler responded with fury. On September 4, 1940, he delivered a speech at the Berlin Sportpalast, promising to erase British cities in retaliation for the bombing of Berlin. The crowd roared approval. 3 days later, on September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a massive daylight raid on London. 348 bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, attacked the British capital in the late afternoon. The raid targeted the docks along the Thames River, industrial facilities, and the transportation infrastructure. Fires erupted across East London. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. German pilots flying over the city that evening saw flames consuming entire neighborhoods. One Luftwaffe pilot recalled seeing the red blazing metropolis, the center of what Nazi ideology called plutocrats and slaveholders, wrapped in flames like the flow of lava from a titanic volcano. The attacks on London continued night after night. The Blitz had begun. For Germans, this shift in strategy was presented as righteous retaliation. Britain had bombed German cities. Now Germany would respond in kind. The propaganda emphasized that Germany had shown restraint by focusing initially on military targets, but British aggression left no choice but to strike at the heart of the enemy's capital. German newsreels showed footage of London burning. Commentators described the destruction with a mixture of grim satisfaction and martial inevitability. The message was clear. Britain had brought this upon itself. Yet, as September progressed, questions began to surface. When would Britain surrender? The raids continued, but no capitulation came. Londoners endured the bombing. The Royal Air Force continued to fly. German losses mounted. Fighter pilots reported that RAF resistance remained fierce. The anticipated collapse did not materialize. The German Security Service, the SD, began noting shifts in public sentiment. Reports from across the Reich indicated that while Germans supported the war effort, they were puzzled by Britain's refusal to concede defeat. Rumors circulated. Some Germans listened to foreign radio broadcasts despite the severe penalties for doing so. Listening to the BBC or other foreign stations was illegal and could result in imprisonment or worse. But the prohibition did not stop everyone. People wanted information beyond official pronouncements. They wanted to understand whether the claims of imminent British collapse were accurate. Some Germans began to admire the English resilience. SD reports noted that no people had withstood Luftwaffe bombing for so long. The British were proving tougher than expected. Doubts extended beyond the battlefield. As the air campaign dragged into October and November, the promised invasion of Britain did not occur. On September 17, 1940, Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The German public was not informed of this decision immediately. Propaganda continued to speak of eventual invasion, but no date was set. Military planners understood that without air superiority, a seaborne landing would face catastrophic losses from the Royal Navy and remaining RAF forces. The Luftwaffe had not destroyed fighter command. British aircraft production exceeded German estimates. Pilot losses on both sides were heavy, but the RAF maintained operational strength. German pilots, flying longer sorties over enemy territory, faced exhaustion and stress. The Luftwaffe began experiencing its first documented cases of war neuroses among pilots, a condition the regime had previously associated with weakness and defeatism. The strain of daily combat missions, losses of comrades, and the relentless nature of the campaign took psychological tolls that could not be entirely suppressed or ignored. On the home front, Germans adapted to a new reality. The war was not ending quickly. Air raid precautions tightened across northwestern Germany. Cities constructed public shelters, though capacity remained limited. In Berlin, only 10% of the population could be accommodated in official bunkers. Most citizens relied on their own cellars or basements. Those with means built private shelters in their gardens. Flak towers began construction in major cities starting in late 1940. These massive concrete structures bristled with anti-aircraft guns and served dual purposes, defending against bombers and providing shelter for civilians. The towers became symbols of defiant resilience, monumental assertions that Germany would hold out against enemy attacks. Yet their very construction acknowledged a reality propaganda preferred to obscure. The war would not end quickly, and German cities were vulnerable. Initially, the Nazi government made little effort to evacuate children from cities. Confidence in swift victory rendered such measures unnecessary. But as the bombing continued and spread, the Kinderlandverschickung program expanded. The name meant sending children to the countryside. Officially described as recreational trips, the evacuations removed millions of children from urban areas to camps and rural communities. The Hitler Youth and National Socialist welfare organizations managed logistics. Parents, fearful for their children's safety, consented to the separations. The program served propaganda purposes as well, presenting the regime as caring for youth while indoctrinating them in Nazi ideology away from parental influence. By the end of the war, approximately 2.5 million German children participated in these evacuations. The scale of the program reflected the prolonged nature of the conflict and the regime's recognition that aerial bombardment posed enduring dangers. As 1940 drew to a close, the Battle of Britain had not delivered the decisive victory Germany anticipated. The Luftwaffe continued raids, but the intensity and scale fluctuated. German bomber crews faced grueling missions. British night defenses improved. Losses accumulated. Hitler's attention turned eastward. On July 31, 1940, even before the peak of the air campaign against Britain, Hitler had instructed his staff to begin planning for an invasion of the Soviet Union. The attack on the USSR had always been central to Hitler's vision, outlined in Mein Kampf and reaffirmed throughout his rise to power. Britain's refusal to surrender was an inconvenience, not an insurmountable obstacle. Germany would continue the air war while preparing for the invasion of the East. This strategic shift was not communicated clearly to the German public. Propaganda still spoke of Britain's imminent defeat, but the timetable grew vague. The Christmas season of 1940 arrived with the war unresolved. One German observer noted that, in general, people were reckoning with a long war without being particularly worried or bothered about it. In its current phase, the war was hardly noticeable to many. The early victories had created a cushion of confidence. Food supplies remained adequate. Consumer goods were still available. The full weight of total war had not yet descended. Life continued with a sense of normalcy punctuated by air raid precautions and occasional bombings in certain regions. For most Germans living outside major cities or industrial zones, the war was distant. They read about it in newspapers, saw it in newsreels, heard about it on the radio, but did not feel its immediate presence. The Battle of Britain, from the German perspective, had become part of the background noise of a conflict whose end seemed postponed rather than imperiled. Yet beneath the surface calm, the Battle of Britain marked a turning point. It was the first major German military campaign that did not achieve its objectives. The Luftwaffe failed to destroy the Royal Air Force. Britain did not capitulate. Operation Sea Lion never proceeded beyond planning stages. German pilots and crews suffered losses that could not be easily replaced. The myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility cracked. Hermann Göring's reputation suffered lasting damage. The German public, though still broadly supportive of the regime and confident in ultimate victory, had encountered the limits of their air power. The British had demonstrated that they could endure, resist, and even strike back. The narrative of swift, inevitable German triumph confronted the reality of prolonged struggle. The war that many Germans believed would end with France's surrender continued into an uncertain future. The Battle of Britain, seen from German soil, was not a catastrophic defeat that shattered morale. It was a gradual, uncomfortable realization that victory might not come as easily as promised. The doubts planted in the autumn of 1940 would grow as the war expanded and the costs mounted. For now, though, the German people held on to hope, adjusted to a longer conflict, and waited for the decisive breakthrough that propaganda assured them would eventually come. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.